Hello everybody. So today, me, putu viola kanno, and my partners Daniel and Valerie will explain to you about comparative advantage. So first, what is comparative advantage? It is an economy's ability to produce a particular good or services at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Or in other words, comparative advantage gives a company the ability to sell the goods and services in a lower price than its competitors and realize stronger sales margins. Fun fact, the concept of comparative advantage was first introduced in 1817 by a British political economist, David Ricardo, in his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. So to understand the further concept of comparative advantage, we're going to use Vietnam and Japan as the example for this material. So first we will assume that both countries of Vietnam and Japan have a demand for rice and motorcycles are such that two goods are consumed in same and fixed proportions. As you can see here, the horizontal line of QR represents the quantity of rice and the vertical line of QM represents the quantity of the motorcycles. From the assumptions, we know that because of the demand of rice and motorcycles are in the same fixed proportions, we present it by drawing a diagonal lines like in figure 3.1. We draw a diagonal lines like this. We call these both lines DD or demand diagonal. So any changes that happens of the two products will result in rotating the DD lines. Either it can go up or down. So in previous chapter, in chapter 2, it says that trade often arises due to differences in supply conditions. So next we will use the example of supply conditions to differ between the Vietnam and Japan. So assume that the resource or technology conditions in Vietnam give it production possibilities frontier or PPF that is biased towards rice. And for the technology condition in Japan, it is biased towards the motorcycle. So first, what is PPF? PPF is a curves that illustrates the variation in the amounts that can be produced of two products if both depend upon the same finite resource for their manufacture. PPF can also be called the transformation curve. So from these assumptions, it will result in Vietnam having a superior technology in rice production. As you can see here, the QR is greater than the QM, and for Japan, it it might have a superior technology in motorcycle production. So because of these reasons, the PPF will take on complementary shapes like this, as you can see here in figure 3.2. We label the intersection of the PPFs with our demand lines with the letter A, like this. So the DD line represents the demand sides of two economies, and the PPFs, here the A's, represent the supply sides of the two economies. So the slope of the PPFs measure the opportunity cost of producing the item on the horizontal line, which is the rice, expressed in the terms of how many units of the vertical or the motorcycles must be given up or not produced because resources have switched to the rice. So in a system of freely operating markets, perfect competition and full employment of production factors, opportunity costs are fully reflected in relative prices. Therefore, the slope of the PPF is the relative price of the rice. We represent it like in the figure 3.3 by drawing a tangent lines to the PPFs where the demand line cross them at points A. As you can see here in Vietnam, this is the tangent line, and in Japan, this is the tangent line. You can see that the tangent line in Vietnam is giving a flatter relative price than in Japan, which means that the opportunity cost of the rice is going to be lower in Vietnam rather than in Japan. So basically these equations says that Vietnam, which is the country that has the supply advantage in producing the rice, has a relatively lower price of the rice rather than Japan. So the PRPM of Vietnam is lower, is less than the PRPM in Japan. So this inequality is an expression of a pattern of comparative advantage. So these differences in economy-wide supply condition cause differences in relative autarky prices, thereby a pattern of comparative advantage. These differences makes the trade possible. So from the equation, we can note that comparative advantage inequality involves four. It involves four prices rather than two prices. As you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So these differences has an immediate and important implication, which is a country can have a comparative advantage in a good and which has an absolute disadvantage. This is one of the reasons why the comparative advantage concept is more powerful than the absolute advantage concept. So for the next part is gonna be explained by my partner, Danielle. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm going to continue my friend's presentation about comparative advantage. And moving on to the next topic, we're going to talk about international trade. Same as before, we're going to use Vietnam and Japan as the examples of this material. And for the main topic, we're going to discuss if Vietnam and Japan abandon autarky in favor of trade. If we're talking about international trade, there will be world price or world market that exists inside the international trade. So therefore, here in our curve, we have added our world price ratio in Vietnam and Japan curve. If you take a look at the curve there, the Vietnam curve, the lines, the world price ratio line there is actually steeper than the autarky price, which is labeled as A. And in Japan, we have the world price ratio line that is flatter than the autarky price line in Japan. The tangencies of these world price lines actually represents or determines the new production point for Vietnam and Japan, which are labeled B in both curves. If you take a look at the curve there, the movement from point A to B actually involves an increase of production In case of Vietnam there, it is the increase of rice production, and Japan is motorcycle production. Now, this increase of production, it is also known as specialization in production. Now, the most important thing that we have to learn here is that moving from autarky to trade, it restructures an economy's production toward the good that has comparative advantage. This is one reason why opening economies up to trading relations with the rest of the world can be difficult for the countries involved. Workers and other resources must be removed from one sector of economy to another in the process. If you take a look at the figure before 3.4, there's a C point which represents consumption. Now, the C in figure 3.4 occur where the dashed word price lines intersect the demand lines. Why? Because both consumption and productions, which are labeled B and C, must respect the wood prices. In contrast to autarky, consumption and production points are now driven through trade. Now let's see the new curve here. So this is the new curve, which we have removed the autarky price lines. If you see here, there's a line there, and here we don't have that anymore. And we're trying to focus on the differences between consumption and production here on both of these curves. Now, if we see on Vietnam, the production of rice is actually larger than the consumption of rice. Therefore, the difference, we export that. And the production of motorcycle is actually lesser than the consumption, so they have to import motorcycles to complement the consumption or the demand. And here in Japan, the production of motorcycle is actually larger than the consumption. Therefore, they have to export the difference. And then the production of rice is lesser than the consumption of rice. So they have to import rice to complement the demand. So what ensures that the quantities imported and exported in figure 3.5 balance? Now let's suppose that the export is lesser than the import. So there will be shortage of a quantity of product, in this case rice, and there will be excess demand for rice, which will increase the price of rice itself because the export is low and the demand is high. If we're talking about the opposite, the import is much lesser than the export, then we have excess of production and we have shortage of demand. And the price of rice will decrease because there are so many rice out there sold. This increase would direct production in both countries along the PPFs toward rice, complementing the excess of demand. Right, as you can see, that's the curve. That's the same with the previous curve. All right. So simple conclusion from what we have learned, having an absolute disadvantage in a product does not preclude having a comparative advantage in that product. Vietnam could have an absolute disadvantage in rice, but still export this product because of its comparative advantage. This is why comparative advantage is a more powerful concept than absolute advantage, which we have learned in the previous chapter. So I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm Valerie and I will continue the presentation. So I will explain about gains from trade. What is gains from trade? Gains from trade refers to that advantage which countries participating in international trade enjoy. For example, from the trading process, the country can increase its economy. And here is the example of gains from trade. And this is the situation before trading process. There are two countries here, Vietnam and Japan. Vietnam have high production of rice. On the other hand, Japan have high production of motorcycle. And this called specialization of trade. Why it called specialization of trade? Because the other country don't have the resource, the same resource as the others. And because of this, Vietnam have demand of motorcycle, and Japan need demand of rice. And after the trading process, Vietnam are able to improve automotive sector and strengthen its logistics, and Japan can fulfill the high demand of rice. So because of this, Vietnam and Japan economic welfare will increase, and this is called gains from trade. So why Japan and Vietnam economic welfare can increase? It is because in Vietnam, when they have motorcycle, it will help them to achieve more efficient and effective logistic. For example, if a customer wants to buy something online and they are from the rural area, which difficult to reach by car, it is they can pay less delivery cost. And for Japan, as a country that consume high amount of rice, it will help them to fulfill the demand of rice, and also when they experience crop failure, it will help them to prevent the lack of rice in the future. And also it will help the business, for example, sushi restaurant that have high demand of rice. And there are facts of trade. So the first one, the gains from trade occur for the country as a whole. So it means that the advantages of trade is not only for individual or a group of people, but for the whole country. And the second one, there will be groups that lose from increased trade. For example, in the previous slide, there are trade between Vietnam and Japan, where Vietnam export rice to Japan. But in Japan, there are farmers that also have rice fields which able to produce rice, which will impact negatively to the local farmers. That's why the government should control the number of importer rice. If not, then there will be groups that lose from increased trade. In this case, the local farmer. The third one, there has also been a great deal of discussion of the impacts of trade based on comparative advantage on the environment. I will explain about it later in the next slide. And the last one, some goods are traded that do not contribute to increase welfare. For example, the trade of drugs, heroin, and prostitution service that traded internationally, that's definitely do not increase welfare. In the next slide, there are comparative advantage and the environment. The first one, we have the scale of or growth effect. It refers to the possibility that trade can stimulate the overall level of economic activity that can in turn have environmental repercussion. For example, trade might stimulate the overall use of natural resources or the overall level of pollution. And according to the research, the hypothesis that environmental degradation first increase and then decrease with the level of economic activity or the GDP. Second is the activity composition effect, refers to something that we have seen in this chapter, namely that trade changes the location of countries on the PPF. These effects usually occur in the production technology and depends on the pattern of comparative advantage. Pollution intensive sectors such as chemical and metals can either increase or decrease their share in the total output of a country. Also, there is the technique effect refers to the possibility that the pollutant intensity of a given level of output in a sector can change, sometimes for the better. For example, there is emission trading. It is an environmental policy that seeks to reduce air pollution efficiently by putting a limit on emissions, giving polluters a certain number of allowance consistent with those limits, and then permitting the polluters to buy and sell the allowance. So the trading of a finite number of allowance result in the market price being put on emissions, which enable polluters to work out the most cost-effective means of reaching the required reduction. So that is one of the example. And the last, the net effect. This net effect would reflect the combined impacts of the scale or growth effect, the activity composition effect, and the technique effect. So basically, the net effect is the combination of those three effects that I already explained before. And now we are on the last part of this our slide. Here we have conclusion. So the conclusion is differences in technology and or in factor endowments among the countries of the world can generate patterns of comparative advantage. Although the patterns of comparative advantage can be influenced by patterns of absolute advantage, they are not determined by patterns of absolute advantage. Indeed, a country can have a comparative advantage in a good in which it has an absolute disadvantage. Patterns of comparative advantage determine patterns of trade in the world economy and generate mutual gains from trade. Additionally, gains from trade arising from comparative advantage are for countries as a whole and not for all individuals and groups within the country. Within any country, there can be both winners and losers from international trade. This is the issue of the political economy of trade.